Bipolar is often described as a cycling illness, going from extremes of depression to mania. Well, for decades, I wasn't really aware of my extreme moods, but I was very aware of my extreme behaviors. There's a long list of them. I'll tell you about just a few of them. In 1981, I finished my first year in graduate school, and I decided to spend my final year sleeping in a park. I actually slept on top of a baseball dugout in a little scorekeeper's booth. Well, by selling my car and not having to pay rent or utilities, I was able to pay off my student debt before I graduated. After graduating, I took a regular job, but I decided to stay homeless. And what I did was give away to charity most of my paychecks. Then I made another change that lasted for decades. I decided to do full-time volunteer work. Eventually, I founded and was the executive director of 3 nonprofits in a row in Richmond, Virginia. The first one, I hired recovering drug addicts to provide street-based HIV prevention to IV drug users who were not in treatment. Meanwhile, I provided outreach to male and transgender sex workers. I moved on from that nonprofit to start one that provided support to LGBT youth, and we were the first organization in the country to use paid television and radio advertisements to reach these youth. And then finally, I started a thrift store to fund the LGBT community. It grew rapidly, it became a multi-million-dollar venture, and we ended up buying a 45,000 square foot building that became the gay community, LGBT community center of Richmond. By then, I was sleeping indoors. I would spend every Monday night at Rob's house, every Tuesday at Nick's, Wednesdays with Fred's, and so forth. When I left the last nonprofit, the person who replaced me took a $65,000 salary. I spent 20 years doing this work, taking only a stipend of only $300 a month. My transportation was also extreme. When I moved here from Richmond 9 years ago, I came up by bicycle with all my possessions either in my backpack or bungeed to the back of the bike. I've also hitchhiked about 20,000 miles, and once I was arrested for it. Well, I decided to plead not guilty on religious grounds. And I testified that if I had to pay for transportation, I couldn't lead the lifestyle that I felt called to. I'm not a Christian, but I quoted the Bible where Jesus says, "Sell all your possessions and give to the poor." I also referenced Martin Luther King in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. He responded to liberal critics who said he was an extremist for using civil disobedience. Dr. King said, "The question isn't whether to be an extremist, the question is what type of an extremist should we be? Extremists for love or for hate? For justice or injustice?" I rested my case, and the judge dismissed the charges. My politics are extreme. I believe that our military is being used primarily to exploit other nations, and I don't want to pay for our wars or interventions. So for each of the last 35 years, I've refused to pay my federal income taxes. I'm very honest about it. I fill out my tax returns and mail them in, but I don't include payment, and I give that money to charity instead. On top of that, I get an annual $5,000 fine from the IRS, which I also don't pay, for writing what they call a frivolous entry on my tax returns. This year, it was a quotation from the former Republican Senator and Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel. Speaking of the Iraq War, Senator Hagel said, people say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are. They talk about America's national interest. What the hell do you think they're talking about? We're not there for figs. Well, despite these and a whole bunch of other extreme behaviors, I never realized that I had a mental illness until 11 years ago when I survived a suicide attempt. The psychiatrist said, "John, you've got classic symptoms of depression." And I said, "Really?" And I wasn't being sarcastic, I was just kind of clueless. Well, I got put on Prozac, and it didn't work, and the side effects really sucked. The most sleep I could get was 3 hours a night, and I couldn't have an orgasm. And that was depressing. I was switched to Lexapro, but it produced the exact same results. After 6 weeks of insomnia, I finally took a sleep aid, and then for the next year, I stayed on the sleep aid along with the antidepressants, and I never noticed it helping, so after a year, I just quit taking it. About 6 years ago, I'd already moved to Boston, and I was feeling suicidal again. But this time, I went for help beforehand, and I got put on a third antidepressant, Celexa. Exact same results as before. All three antidepressants were SSRIs, so they decided to try a different class. So I tried Remeron. I slept like a baby. But it gave me the worst irritability I had ever experienced in my life. I quit taking it after 2 days because I screamed at my housemate just because he said hello to me. One thing that really helped was I started attending a support program for people with mood disorders, the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. About 100 people come every Wednesday night and break into about a dozen different interest groups. There's a depression group, mania, dual diagnosis, a youth group, and so forth. Well, I went to the depression group. And in that group, there were some bipolars, because bipolars experience depression a lot more often than they experience mania. And when they introduced themselves, some of the bipolars said that they had type 1, and others said that they had type 2. I hadn't heard of that, so I asked what the difference was, and I was told that with bipolar type 1, you get full-blown mania, which might be psychotic. Whereas with type 2, they get a lesser form of mania called hypomania, and they never get psychotic. And I thought, you know, I wonder if that's me. I just had a sense all along that I was dealing with something more than just depression. Well, as soon as I got home, I looked up bipolar type 2, and almost everything I read seemed to apply to me. One website said, if you have tried 3 or more antidepressants and they didn't help or even made you worse, and if you have tried therapy and it didn't help, you might be bipolar. I read that antidepressants tend to push bipolar people to mania, and that insomnia and irritability are 2 of the symptoms of mania. I read that a typical bipolar person will see several psychiatrists before they get correctly diagnosed. I had seen 4. And I read that half of all type 2s will attempt suicide. Well, I decided to seek out an expert on bipolar disorder, and there's a very prominent psychiatrist here in Boston who's one of the world's experts. And he was able to see me, and after a lengthy assessment, he said, "Mr. Klein, it's very clear to me that what you've been dealing with your entire adult life is not unipolar depression. You are bipolar." It might sound strange, too, that I was so happy to hear that, but my whole world finally made sense, and it became a lot easier to deal with things. Now when I go through a really bad mood, I know that it tends to cycle through me, and if I don't freak out about it, it tends to dissipate much, much quicker. I got, I continued to educate myself about bipolar disorder. One of the things I read was that for unipolars, if they make a suicide attempt, they're only successful, if you want to call it successful, once out of every 30 attempts. With bipolar people, however, 1 out of every 3 attempts leads to death. And I have an understanding, not just from what I've read, but personally, why that's the case. The difference, of course, between unipolars and bipolars is that we get mania or hypomania in addition to depression. And when you're in what's called a mixed state, where you're experiencing both depression and mania at the same time, that's when things are most dangerous for us. If you're in a deep depression and also highly irritable, can't sleep, and your mind is being bombarded with racing thoughts, very negative thoughts, basically your own mind can become a torture chamber, and you want out. There's a pretty well-known psychiatrist who wrote a book about her own bipolar illness, and she entitled that An Unquiet Mind. And I think that's a perfect description. I have an unquiet mind. There's times when when I try to go to bed at night, my mind just won't shut down. And it's not necessarily because of stress. Like, I might see a movie that I enjoy, and when I try to sleep, I replay the movie in my head or a whole bunch of scenes from it, and then I'll kind of play around with it. Like, if I was the director, I think I would have done this and, changed. I would have casted this actor instead of that actor, and so forth. And it can go on for hours, sometimes the entire night. But that type of manic energy can lead to creativity and productivity, all this energy. And I think that's one reason why the thrift store I started quickly grew into the most popular one in Richmond. But an unquiet mind can also be quite a nuisance at times as well. Not just when I'm trying to sleep, but during waking hours, it can really interfere with things. Like, there are times that I will just isolate myself because I find it easier to deal with loneliness when I'm alone than I'm with a whole bunch of people or with friends and not able to really be present because of too much activity going on in my head. And that brings me back to magic mushrooms. I tried them 7 years ago, not knowing much about them. I had very little experience with drugs at that time. I'd never even gotten high on marijuana. And it wasn't a very remarkable experience. It was basically vivid colors and a lot of laughter. But what was remarkable was how I felt the next day. My mind had never felt so clear, so uncluttered with thoughts. I saw my housemates sitting at the breakfast table, and I was thinking, it would be so easy to get along with them and with everyone if my mind was like this more often. So I made the decision that that morning, I didn't know about bipolar disorder then. All I knew is that I knew something about depression, that I was experiencing it, and so I immediately got online and Googled magic mushrooms and depression. And these Johns Hopkins studies and all these other reports came out showing just dramatic results. So that's when I made the decision to try treating myself with psilocybin. Unfortunately, I was not well connected. I didn't know where to get any more of it. I just had a friend give me a little bit of that. And I went to a bunch of friends, and then a year later or so, I had been diagnosed bipolar, and I decided to follow the standard treatment, which for bipolar disorder is a mood stabilizer. And I stayed on that for several years. I didn't have any side effects, but I also didn't notice any real benefits from it either. So when I finally did meet someone who we've since become very good friends, who can get me mushrooms anytime, he grows mushrooms. I went to my psychiatrist and I said, I'm going to come off the mood stabilizer and turn to psilocybin. Well, he unsuccessfully tried to talk me out of it, and he realized he wasn't going to succeed, so he said, well, we have to end this, because if you're not going to accept treatment, I can't see you. He did make one, I thought, very powerful argument for not coming off of medication, and that was, he said, John, you're going to be playing Russian roulette, except your gun has 5 chambers in it and 1 bullet. And he said, because the statistics show that 1 out of every 5 non-medicated bipolar people will kill themselves. But I was undeterred, and it's only been in recent months that I've been taking it regularly once a month. I'm very pleased to report that I haven't had, they've all been positive experiences, all different. I haven't had anything negative happen. But I'm a little disappointed because I got my hopes way up from the studies. And one of the things that Dr. Griffiths, who heads the psilocybin studies at Johns Hopkins, has pointed out is that there's a high correlation between achieving a full mystical experience, and he lists like 6 characteristics of that, and having lasting benefits from psilocybin. I've only had a little smatterings of these mystical experiences, not the full-on thing, but I'm going to keep trying. I also want to try microdosing. I would also like to connect with other bipolars who have tried psilocybin or other psychedelics, and I'm having a hard time doing that. Unfortunately, bipolars are deliberately excluded from all the studies that are being conducted, and I can understand that. The reasons for that. Probably they're afraid that it might have an adverse effect and lead to suicide or risky hypomanic behavior or whatever. But on the other hand, I think bipolars are in dire need of effective type of treatments. So I've decided to conduct a survey. There've got to be thousands of bipolars out there who have tried psychedelics, and I want to see what their experiences were like. And I have a whole bunch of questions that I want to get answered. It wouldn't surprise me, for example, that type 1s who get psychotic might not tolerate it well, whereas type 2s, it might be a godsend to them. Who knows? But I find it, I've read a whole bunch of places on different websites where it says bipolars shouldn't even attempt to use magic mushrooms or whatever. And I find that very condescending. It's our life. Some of us are desperate. And, when I've been replicating the studies, having a trip sitter, putting an eye mask on, all that type of stuff. And it's not like these people in the studies are magicians, They're there to provide assurance. And I can get a friend who can do that too, One other thing I'd like to say about bipolar disorder, a couple other things actually. If I could choose whether to be bipolar or not, despite all the difficulties that I've been through, despite almost losing my life, I actually had the same method of suicide that Robin Williams used. And by the way, it wasn't reported in the news, but I'm convinced that he was bipolar. I mean, he screamed mania, But despite all that, there have been benefits too. And if nothing else, my life has been not only unique, but very rewarding. I can't say it's been a happy life, but it's been filled with purpose and meaning, and that fills me deep down with something really good. The other thing I'd like to say is a remark that when I was reading the bipolar website, most prominent psychiatrist who's written about bipolar type 2, Dr. Phelps, who wrote a book called Why Am I Still Depressed? About type 2. And he said that one of the reasons he specializes in bipolar disorder is because it seems that almost every single bipolar person he sees seems to be unusually intelligent or creative or charismatic. And that's certainly the case with a lot of famous bipolars like Beethoven, Mozart, Albert Einstein, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and my favorite, Vincent van Gogh. I'm hoping that eventually science might find a way where bipolar people can benefit from their condition without having to go through all the torments. And I think psychedelics might be part of the answer. I definitely think it's worth studying to find out. And I'm going to study on myself to find out. Thank you for listening.